Hey guys, tonight we begin with something Hollywood has spectacularly misrepresented for decades. Ancient Rome, not the gladiator fighting, orgy having, emperor murdering spectacle of films, but the actual city and civilization where millions of ordinary people lived, worked, raised families, and navigated a complex urban society that was simultaneously remarkably advanced and deeply unequal. We're talking about real Romans who dealt with traffic, complained about rent, enjoyed public baths, and tried to make sense of a world that was rapidly expanding beyond anything humanity had seen before. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the city itself, because Rome at its height was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. By the 1st century CE, Rome had a population of about 1 million people, making it the largest city in the world, and one that wouldn't be matched in size until London in the 19th century. 1 million people crammed into about 5 square miles of urban area meant density that was staggering, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. The city sprawled across 7 hills, though the romanticized 7 hills of Rome were really just the ceremonial center. The actual urban area extended far beyond, a maze of streets, alleys, markets, temples, public buildings, and the endless residential blocks called insulae. These apartment buildings, some rising 5 or 6 stories, housed the majority of Rome's population in conditions that ranged from merely cramped to genuinely squalid. If you were an ordinary Roman, not wealthy, not connected, just a regular person trying to survive, you lived in an insula. These were the ancient equivalent of tenement buildings, constructed cheaply and quickly to maximize rental income for their owners. The ground floors were usually shops or workshops, their fronts open to the street during business hours. Above were apartments, divided and subdivided into smaller units as you went higher. The best apartments were on the 1st and 2nd floors, closer to the street, easier to access, and somewhat safer. These might have multiple rooms, running water from lead pipes connected to the city's aqueduct system, and even primitive toilets that drained into sewers. If you were a successful shopkeeper, a skilled craftsman, or a lower-level government clerk, you might afford one of these. But most people lived higher up, in smaller, darker, more cramped spaces. 3rd, 4th, 5th floor apartments had no running water. You carried water up from public fountains in the street, hauling heavy clay amphorae up narrow stairs multiple times daily. There were no toilets. You used chamber pots and emptied them into large jars on the street that were collected periodically. Or if you were less considerate, you just threw the contents out the window, hoping nobody was passing below. Fire was a constant threat. Cooking was done over small charcoal braziers, the only heat source in winter and necessary for preparing food. Buildings were made primarily of wood, with plaster and some brick, highly flammable materials. Fire spread rapidly, and Rome burned repeatedly throughout its history. The Great Fire of 64 CE, supposedly started by Nero, destroyed vast sections of the city. But smaller fires happened constantly, almost daily somewhere in the city. Collapse was another danger. Insulae were built cheaply with minimal foundation, sometimes on unstable ground. Upper floors were added without proper structural support. Buildings swayed in wind, creaked ominously, and sometimes just fell down, crushing inhabitants. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, tried to regulate building heights, limiting new construction to about 70 feet. But enforcement was inconsistent, and landlords constantly sought workarounds to maximize rental units. Despite these dangers, living in Rome meant access to amenities no other ancient city could match. The aqueduct system brought fresh water from sources up to 50 miles away, flowing through massive stone channels elevated on arches, then distributed throughout the city through a network of pipes and fountains. Public fountains were everywhere, within a few hundred feet of any residence, providing free fresh water to all citizens. Public toilets, the famous Roman latrines, were communal facilities where dozens of people sat side by side on marble benches with holes, conducting business and conversing simultaneously. Privacy wasn't a Roman concern, at least not in the way we understand it. The latrines flushed continuously with running water channeled from the aqueducts through sewers beneath. They were actually quite hygienic by ancient standards, though the social experience of group defecation takes some getting used to for modern sensibilities. The baths, the thermae, were central to Roman life. These weren't just bathing facilities, but social centers, exercise complexes, and community gathering spaces. Entry was cheap, sometimes free, subsidized by the state or wealthy patrons seeking public favor. Men and women bathed at different times, usually men in the afternoon after work, women in the morning. A typical bath experience involved several stages. You started in the changing room, the apoditerium, where you left your clothes with an attendant who watched them. Theft was common. Then you might exercise in the palastra, an open courtyard with weights, balls, and space for wrestling or other athletics. This got you sweating, preparing for the baths. The bathing sequence typically went from hot to cold. The caldarium was intensely hot, heated by a hypocaust system, where hot air from furnaces circulated beneath the floor and inside the walls. You sat in the steamy heat, sweating profusely. Slaves or attendants might scrape your skin with a strigil, a curved metal tool that removed oil, sweat, and dead skin. This was considered cleansing and invigorating, though it must have been uncomfortable. Next came the tepidarium, a warm room, then finally the frigidarium, cold water pools, where you plunged in to close your pores and refresh. Some baths had swimming pools, the natio, and many had gardens, libraries, and rooms for massage, hair removal, or other grooming. The baths were social equalizers. Rich and poor, senator and shopkeeper, all bathed together, at least in theory. In practice, the wealthy often had private changing areas and brought slaves to attend them, but the ideal was communal. Conversations happened, business was conducted, gossip was shared. The baths were where Romans connected, networked, and maintained the social fabric of urban life. Food culture in Rome was complex and varied by class. The wealthy ate elaborately, multiple courses featuring exotic imports: peacock, flamingo, dormice fattened in jars, fish sauce called garum, made from fermented fish guts, that was simultaneously expensive and disgusting to modern tastes. They dined reclining on couches, served by slaves, entertainment provided by musicians or performers. Ordinary Romans ate more simply. Bread was the staple provided through a grain dole for citizens, about 40 pounds per month of wheat that you took to a bakery to be ground and baked for a small fee. This bread was dense, coarse, and filling, the foundation of every meal. Olive oil provided fat and flavor. Wine, usually diluted with water, because drinking it straight was considered barbaric, was consumed with every meal. Vegetables were common: onions, garlic, cabbage, leeks, lentils, beans. Fruit included apples, pears, grapes, figs, and dates. Meat was expensive and eaten sparingly by most people. Maybe once a week if you were lucky, more often at festivals or public feasts sponsored by politicians or the emperor. Fish and poultry were more accessible than red meat. Street food was ubiquitous. Most apartment dwellers had no kitchen facilities beyond a small brazier, making home cooking difficult. So you ate out, buying hot food from thermopolia, fast food counters that lined every street. These served stews, bread, sausages, and other prepared foods from large clay jars set into marble counters. You stood at the counter, ate quickly, and went about your day. It was cheap, convenient, and variable in quality. Dining culture had rules. Breakfast, ientaculum, was minimal, maybe bread and cheese. Lunch, prandium, was light, eaten quickly. The main meal, cena, came in the afternoon after work and could last hours for those with time and resources. Dinner parties, convivia, were major social events for the elite, featuring elaborate courses, entertainment, poetry recitations, and philosophical discussions that lasted late into the night. Work dominated most Romans' lives. The economy was diverse, employing people in every imaginable occupation: shopkeepers, bakers, butchers, fishmongers, wine merchants, oil dealers, all operated small businesses, often in the ground floors of insulae. Craftsmen included potters, metalworkers, jewelers, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, and countless specialized trades. Laborers worked in construction, constantly building and rebuilding the city. Dock workers loaded and unloaded ships at the port of Ostia. Wagoners and mule drivers transported goods, though wheeled vehicles were banned from city streets during daylight hours due to traffic congestion, meaning deliveries happened at night, creating noise that kept residents awake. Slaves performed enormous amounts of labor. Rome ran on slavery, and perhaps 30 to 40% of the urban population was enslaved. Slaves did everything: domestic work, crafts, construction, mining, agriculture in the countryside. Some slaves were highly educated, serving as teachers, doctors, or secretaries for wealthy families. Others performed back-breaking labor in appalling conditions, especially in mines or on large agricultural estates. The legal status of slavery was absolute, but the actual experience varied wildly. Some slaves were treated almost as family members, educated, eventually freed, and given opportunities to prosper. Urban domestic slavery could be relatively comfortable compared to alternatives, but other slaves were worked to death in mines, branded, beaten, and treated as disposable property with no rights whatsoever. Slavery was morally unreflective. Romans didn't question its fundamental legitimacy, only debating how slaves should be treated within the system. Freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted, formed a significant class. Some became wealthy and influential, though they faced social prejudices. Citizenship could be granted to freed slaves, and their children were born free citizens, allowing upward mobility across generations. This social fluidity, unusual in ancient societies, contributed to Rome's dynamism, but also created tensions between old aristocratic families and newly wealthy freedmen. Politics touched everyone's life, though actual power was limited to the elite. The Senate, composed of wealthy landowners and former magistrates, controlled most policy. Elections for magistracies, consulships, praetorships, aedileships, involved intense campaigning, bribery, and occasionally violence. Ordinary citizens voted in assemblies, but voting was organized in ways that gave disproportionate weight to the wealthy. Still, public opinion mattered. Politicians needed popular support, so they sponsored games, built public works, distributed food, and generally tried to keep the masses content. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, captured this: keep people fed and entertained, and they won't revolt. It was cynical but effective. Legal status mattered enormously. Roman citizens had rights. They couldn't be summarily executed, could appeal to higher authorities, had access to courts. Non-citizens, the vast majority of empire's population, had fewer protections. Citizenship was valuable and could be purchased, granted for military service, or inherited. The extension of citizenship to more people over Rome's history helped maintain loyalty and integration of conquered peoples. Family structure was patriarchal. The pater familias, head of household, had near absolute authority over wife, children, and slaves. He could accept or reject newborns, determining if they'd be raised or exposed, left outside to die, or be picked up by slavers. He arranged children's marriages, controlled family property, and represented the family legally. Women had limited rights, but more independence than in some ancient societies, especially Greek city-states. Roman women could own property, though it was usually managed by male guardians. They could conduct business, divorce, and some wealthy women wielded considerable behind-the-scenes influence. But they couldn't vote, hold office, or participate directly in public life. Marriage was primarily economic and political. Families arranged marriages to create alliances, merge properties, or advance social status. Love was nice if it happened, but wasn't the primary consideration. Divorce was common and relatively easy, requiring only a declaration of intent. Children usually stayed with the father, and dowries were returned to the wife's family. Childhood was brief. Infant mortality was horrific. Perhaps 30% died before age 1, and half didn't survive to adulthood. Children who survived past early childhood began working young, learning trades from fathers, or being apprenticed out. Education existed, but was for those who could afford it. Basic literacy was more common in Rome than many places, needed for commerce and administration, but still only a minority of the population could read and write well. Schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and for the wealthy, rhetoric and philosophy. Teachers were often Greek slaves, or freedmen, as Greek culture and language were considered essential for educated Romans. Learning involved rote memorization, recitation, and physical punishment for errors. It was harsh but effective for those who persisted. Entertainment was abundant and often free. The games, ludi, included theatrical performances, chariot races, gladiatorial combats, and animal hunts. These were sponsored by politicians, emperors, or wealthy individuals seeking popularity. Attendance was free, and enormous venues like the Circus Maximus, holding 150,000 spectators, or the Colosseum, holding 50,000, were regularly filled. Theater included comedies, tragedies, and mimes, the latter being vulgar, bawdy performances that were enormously popular with ordinary people. Chariot racing was the most popular spectator sport, with factions, teams identified by colors like blue, green, red, and white, developing fanatical followings. Riots between factions occasionally erupted, and betting was ubiquitous. Religion permeated daily life, but was more about practice than belief. Romans were polytheistic, worshipping many gods inherited from Greek, Etruscan, and other traditions. Jupiter, king of gods; Juno, his wife Mars, god of war; Venus, goddess of love. Dozens more had temples, festivals, and cult practices, but religion was transactional. You performed rituals and offerings to gain divine favor, not because of deep theological conviction. Household religion was important. Every home had a lararium, a shrine to household gods, the lares and penates, spirits protecting the family. Daily offerings of food, wine, and incense maintained their goodwill. Ancestor worship honored dead family members, who were believed to watch over descendants. Public religion was state-sponsored, with priests who were usually aristocrats performing civic duties. Major festivals involved processions, sacrifices of animals, and public feasts. These weren't somber affairs, but celebrations, holidays when work stopped and people enjoyed themselves. Foreign cults gained popularity, especially in the Empire period. Isis from Egypt, Cybele from Anatolia, Mithras from Persia, all attracted followers in Rome, often among specific groups, like soldiers for Mithras or women for Isis. Mystery religions, with secret initiation rites and promises of afterlife salvation, offered spiritual satisfaction traditional Roman religion didn't provide. Christianity emerged in this religious marketplace, initially as a Jewish sect, then spreading among various groups, especially urban poor and slaves, attracted to its message of equality before God and resurrection. It was persecuted sporadically. Believers were seen as atheists for refusing to honor Roman gods and as disloyal for not worshiping the emperor's genius. But it grew steadily until Constantine's conversion in the 4th century CE made it eventually the dominant religion. Disease was constant and deadly. Malaria from the marshes around Rome killed many annually. Tuberculosis, gastrointestinal infections from contaminated food and water, and various fevers ravaged the population. The plague, probably smallpox, struck in the 2nd century CE, killing millions across the empire. Medicine was a mix of effective practices and complete nonsense. Roman doctors, often Greek slaves or freedmen, understood anatomy better than medieval Europeans would, performed some surgeries successfully, and used many effective drugs derived from plants. But they also relied on humoral theory, bloodletting, and treatments that did more harm than good. Public health measures helped. Aqueducts provided clean water. Sewers removed waste, though not all buildings were connected. Public baths promoted hygiene, though they probably also spread disease through contaminated water. Overall, urban living was unhealthy, and life expectancy was perhaps 25–30 years on average, though those who survived childhood could live into their 50s or 60s. The rich lived very differently. They owned spacious houses, domus, with multiple rooms arranged around an atrium, a central courtyard open to the sky with a pool catching rainwater. These houses had dining rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, with actual cooking facilities, private baths in some cases, gardens with fountains and sculptures, and elaborate decorations, including frescoes, mosaics, and expensive imported marbles. The wealthiest also owned suburban villas, country estates with farms, vineyards, and luxurious accommodations, where they escaped the city's summer heat and diseases. These villas were self-sufficient, producing food and wine, staffed by dozens or hundreds of slaves, and serving as showcases of wealth and culture, with libraries, art collections, and beautiful landscaping. The gap between rich and poor was vast and visible. A senator might own property worth millions of sesterces and command hundreds of slaves. A laborer might earn 3–4 sesterces per day, barely enough to rent a room and buy food. There was a middle class of successful shopkeepers, contractors, and skilled craftsmen who owned property and lived comfortably, but the majority struggled constantly. Social mobility existed, but was limited. Successful merchants or freedmen could become wealthy, but they faced prejudice from the old aristocracy who despised new money and trade as beneath noble dignity. Military service offered advancement for some successful soldiers could retire with land grants and pensions, but most people died in the same social position they were born into. Time moved differently for Romans. The day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 of darkness, meaning hours were longer in summer and shorter in winter. There were no minutes or seconds. Telling time involved sundials in public spaces or water clocks for those who could afford them, but precision wasn't valued the way it is now. You met when the sun was at a certain height, not at 3:30 p.m. The calendar was complex, based on lunar months initially, but reformed by Julius Caesar into the solar-based Julian calendar we essentially still use. Months were divided into kalends, nones, and ides, with days counted backward from these markers. It was confusing, and even educated Romans occasionally got dates wrong. As night fell over Rome, the city transformed. Reputable people stayed home. The streets belonged to workers, criminals, and soldiers. Wheeled traffic rumbled through, making sleep difficult. Fires started and were fought by the vigils, a combination fire brigade and police force. Taverns stayed open, serving cheap wine and sometimes providing prostitution. The city was dangerous after dark, and wealthy people who had to go out traveled with armed escorts. But for most Romans, night meant rest after exhausting days of physical labor. You climbed the stairs to your cramped apartment, ate a simple meal, perhaps talked with family or neighbors, and then slept on a straw mattress or simple bed frame. Tomorrow would bring more of the same work, struggle, small pleasures where you could find them, and the hope that maybe things would improve, that your children might have better opportunities, that the empire would continue providing stability and the urban amenities that made life bearable. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine that Roman apartment. The sounds of the street below, carts rumbling, people talking, dogs barking, the smell of cooking fires and human habitation. The presence of family close by in small spaces, the exhaustion of physical labor, the satisfaction of a day survived, the community bonds forged through shared struggle in an enormous, impersonal city. Rome was brutal, unfair, overcrowded, and often dangerous. But it was also vibrant, connected, offering opportunities and experiences impossible in small villages. It was humanity learning to live in dense urban environments, creating culture, law, and infrastructure that would influence civilization for millennia. The Romans were flawed, their society was unjust, but they built something extraordinary that we're still learning from 2,000 years later. Rest well, and let the eternal city carry you gently into dreams of marble temples, bustling forums, and the endless human drama of survival and aspiration playing out in the shadow of the empire. And more, we've explored daily life in Rome. Now let's discuss something Romans were absolutely obsessed with: entertainment, specifically the brutal, spectacular, and wildly popular gladiatorial games. These contests weren't just mindless violence, though they were certainly violent. They were complex cultural performances that revealed Roman values, anxieties, and the strange intersection of death, honor, and public spectacle. So let's understand what gladiatorial combat actually was, who fought, why, and what it meant to the millions who watched. First, let's dispel some myths created by Hollywood. Gladiators didn't usually fight to the death in every match. Most combats ended with one fighter yielding, and the decision to kill or spare was made by the sponsor of the games, not by the crowd's thumbs. The famous thumbs down for death is probably a misunderstanding of ancient sources. The actual gesture is unclear, and gladiators weren't random slaves thrown into arenas with no training. They were professional fighters, extensively trained, valuable property, and sometimes celebrities with devoted fans. Gladiatorial combat originated in Etruscan funeral rites, where fights to the death honored the deceased, the blood sacrifice honoring the dead, and possibly providing them with servants in the afterlife. Romans adopted and expanded this practice. By the late Republic and Imperial period, gladiatorial games, munera, were massive public entertainments sponsored by politicians, emperors, or wealthy individuals seeking popularity and demonstrating their generosity and power. The games usually occurred as part of larger festivals that included theatrical performances, chariot races, and public feasts. They lasted multiple days, sometimes weeks. The Colosseum, Rome's most famous arena though not the only one, opened in 80 CE with games lasting 100 days and featuring thousands of gladiators and thousands of animals. This was excessive even by Roman standards, but it shows the scale these events could reach. Who became gladiators? The answer is more varied than you'd think. Some were slaves, purchased specifically for training as gladiators, or condemned criminals sentenced to the arena as punishment. Others were prisoners of war, though valuable captives might be displayed, then released or ransomed. These were unfree gladiators, fighting because they had no choice. But surprisingly, some gladiators were volunteers, free men who signed contracts to fight. Why would anyone volunteer for something so dangerous? Several reasons. Fame and fortune. Successful gladiators could become wealthy and famous, receiving prize money, gifts from admirers, and sometimes freedom for enslaved fighters. Desperate poverty. Signing up for gladiatorial training provided food, shelter, and a chance at wealth when other options had failed. And sometimes, twisted as it sounds, the thrill and glory of combat attracted adventurous or violent men who genuinely wanted to fight. Gladiators trained in schools, ludi, run by lanistae, the managers who owned or contracted the fighters. The most famous school was in Capua, where Spartacus's revolt began in 73 BCE. These schools housed fighters in barracks, fed them well. Gladiators needed to be strong and impressive, and provided intensive training in specific fighting styles. There were many gladiatorial types, each with distinct armor, weapons, and fighting techniques. The Murmillo wore a helmet with a fish crest, carried a large rectangular shield and a short sword, and had armor on his right arm and left leg. This was a heavily armored defensive style. The Thrakes had a smaller rectangular shield, a curved sword, and armor on both legs and arms, a quicker, more aggressive fighter. The Retiarius was the most distinctive, fighting with a net trident and dagger, wearing minimal armor, relying on speed and reach to entangle and strike opponents before they could close distance. The Hoplomachus fought like a Greek hoplite with a spear, small round shield, and moderate armor. The Secutor, the chaser, was designed specifically to fight Retiari, with a smooth, rounded helmet that wouldn't catch in nets, and heavy armor to withstand trident strikes. The different types created varied matchups. Murmillo versus Thrakes, Retiarius versus Secutor, keeping the spectacle interesting and allowing betting on different styles. Training was brutal and dangerous. Gladiators practiced with wooden weapons against posts, against each other, and sometimes in mock combats with blunted weapons. Injuries were common even in training. Techniques were refined endlessly. Footwork, shield positioning, attack angles, defense. A gladiator's life expectancy was short, maybe a couple of years of active fighting before death, crippling injury, or occasionally retirement. But during that time, they were athletes at peak performance. Diet was surprisingly specific. Gladiators ate mostly barley, beans, and vegetables, a high carbohydrate diet that built bulk. Meat was minimal, contradicting the modern association of meat with strength. The goal was a layer of fat over muscle, which provided protection against cuts while still allowing impressive physique. This made gladiators look strong and intimidating while actually offering some defense against weapons. Medical care was excellent by ancient standards. Gladiators were expensive investments, and keeping them healthy was profitable. Skilled doctors treated injuries, using techniques sometimes ahead of general medical practice. The famous physician Galen started his career treating gladiators, where he gained extensive experience with traumatic injuries. The day of the games began with a pampa, a parade through the streets. Gladiators marched in decorated armor, musicians played, and spectators lined routes to catch glimpses of fighters they'd soon see in action. This built anticipation and allowed gladiators to display themselves to the public. At the arena, usually in the morning, the warm-up acts were animal hunts, venationes, exotic animals, lions, elephants, bears, ostriches, rhinoceroses, were driven into the arena and fought by bestiari, specialized animal fighters. Sometimes animals fought each other, sometimes they hunted criminals condemned to death, domatio ad bestias, thrown into the arena, unarmed to be killed by lions or other predators. This was considered justice and entertainment combined, punishment for the condemned and spectacle for the crowd. Midday brought executions of criminals, sometimes elaborately staged. Condemned criminals might be forced to reenact mythological scenes that ended in death, like Daedalus being burned, or Hercules dying in flames. These executions were brutal and public, reminding the populace of the state's power and the consequences of crime. The main gladiatorial combats came in the afternoon. Before each fight, gladiators were inspected to ensure weapons were sharp and armor was properly secured. This wasn't safety concern, but ensuring the fight would be genuine and bloody. Dull weapons made boring fights, and sponsors wanted their money's worth in spectacle. Fights began with a formal salute. Gladiators addressed the sponsor, supposedly saying, "Those who are about to die salute you. Morituri te salutant," though whether this was standard practice is debated. Then combat began, usually one-on-one though. Sometimes group battles or exotic matchups were arranged. Actual combat was skilled and relatively restrained, not wild flailing. Gladiators probed for openings, tested defenses, and struck carefully. Wasting energy in a fight that might last minutes or even hours was foolish. The crowd wanted drama, skill, and eventually blood, but not immediately. A good fight built tension, showed technical proficiency, and gave spectators time to appreciate the warrior's courage and ability. Wounds accumulate, blood flows. Eventually, one fighter gains a decisive advantage, landing a serious blow or simply exhausting his opponent. The losing gladiator, if still conscious and able, signaled submission, usually by raising a finger. This appeal for mercy missio meant requesting the sponsor's decision on his fate. Here's where it gets complicated. The sponsor, sometimes the emperor if he was attending, could grant missio, allowing the defeated gladiator to live, or decree his execution. The crowd's opinion mattered. They shouted and gestured, but the decision was the sponsor's. Factors included how well both fighters had performed, the gladiators' records, how expensive they were to replace, and the political calculation of what would please the crowd most. Granting mercy was common enough that most gladiators survived individual combats. A skilled gladiator might fight several times per year and survive years in the profession, but the cumulative risk was high. Eventually, a bad matchup, an injury, bad luck, or declining skills would lead to defeat and possibly death. The mathematics of risk caught up with everyone, eventually. Gladiators who won received prizes. Palm fronds symbolizing victory money, sometimes gifts from admirers thrown into the arena. Successful gladiators became famous, their names and records inscribed on monuments. Graffiti in Pompeii shows gladiators were sex symbols, women's fantasies, despite their low social status. A gladiator might be enslaved and facing death, but if he was handsome and successful, he had female admirers and enjoyed a bizarre celebrity. Retirement was possible for the luckiest. The gladiator who survived enough fights could be granted the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom from obligation to fight. Freed gladiators sometimes became trainers, bodyguards for the wealthy, or returned to civilian life if they had skills and savings. But most died in the arena, or from accumulated injuries before reaching retirement. Now let's discuss the spectators, because understanding who watched and why is crucial. Attendance was free, subsidized by sponsors. The Colosseum seated about 50,000, with strict social hierarchy in seating. The emperor and senators sat closest to the arena, in the best seats. Behind them, equestrians, the wealthy business class. Higher up, ordinary citizens. At the very top, women and the poorest citizens. Slaves stood in the very back, or weren't admitted at all, depending on the event. Seating by status reinforced social order visibly. Everyone knew their place, literally, but everyone attended together, poor and rich watching the same spectacle, sharing the experience, if not the comfort. This was important politically. The games created a sense of shared Roman identity across class lines. Why did Romans love these games? Modern sensibilities find it horrifying, celebrating death as entertainment, but Romans saw it differently. They valued virtus, courage, martial prowess, and glory. Gladiators embodied these virtues, facing death with courage, fighting skillfully, dying when they did bravely. This was admirable, even if the gladiator himself was socially despised as a slave or criminal. The games also reinforced Roman superiority. Exotic animals from across the empire were defeated, showing Rome's dominance over nature. Foreign enemies, paraded then executed or forced to fight, demonstrated military power. The games were imperial propaganda, celebrating conquest and order. There was also a darker element, catharsis through violence. Rome was a violent society. Wars, public executions, domestic violence, all common. Watching controlled violence in the arena might have channeled aggressive impulses safely, though this is speculative. Sociologists still debate whether violent entertainment increases or decreases real-world violence. Some Romans did object to the games. Philosophers, especially Stoics, criticized them as cruel and degrading, both to participants and to spectators who enjoyed suffering. Cicero called them vulgar distractions. Early Christians condemned them as sinful, celebrating death and violence. But these were minority voices. The games remained popular until the decline of the Western Empire, finally banned in the 5th century CE, partly due to Christian influence, but mostly because the empire couldn't afford them anymore. Not all arena entertainments were gladiatorial combat. Chariot racing was arguably more popular, with the Circus Maximus holding 150,000 spectators, triple the Colosseum's capacity. Races were team sports, with factions, blues, greens, reds, whites, developing fanatical followings. Charioteers could become extremely wealthy. One named Diocles supposedly earned 35 million sesterces over his career, a fortune that would make him wealthy even by modern standards. Racing was dangerous. Crashes, naufragia, shipwrecks happened regularly. Charioteers could be tangled in reins, dragged, trampled by horses, or crushed by other chariots. Some carried knives to cut themselves free in emergencies, but deaths and serious injuries were common. Yet successful charioteers who survived long enough became celebrities, their faces known across the empire. Theatrical performances were also popular, though less prestigious than athletics. Comedies, tragedies, and especially mimes, vulgar comedic performances with sexual content and slapstick humor, entertained crowds. Actors had low social status, often slaves or freedmen, but successful ones could become wealthy. Women could perform, rare for public roles in Rome, though actresses were often assumed to be sexually available, whether or not this was true. Public festivals featured all these entertainments, plus processions, sacrifices, and public feasts. The sponsor's generosity was on display, feeding thousands, providing entertainment, and essentially buying loyalty and political support. This patron-client relationship scaled up. The emperor or politician as patron to the entire populace as clients was fundamental to how Roman politics worked. The economic impact of the games was substantial. Thousands were employed: gladiator trainers, animal handlers, arena workers, vendors selling food and drink, prostitutes serving the crowds, bookies taking bets. The games stimulated the economy, redistributing wealth from sponsors to workers and traders. But the cost was also enormous. Importing exotic animals from Africa or Asia, maintaining gladiator schools, building and maintaining arenas, all required vast resources. Only the very wealthy or the imperial treasury could afford major games, making them effective demonstrations of power. If you could sponsor games, you were important. If you couldn't, you weren't. Spartacus's revolt in 73 BCE illustrates gladiators' complex position. Spartacus was a Thracian, possibly a deserter from the Roman army, enslaved and trained as a gladiator. He and about 70 other gladiators escaped from their school in Capua, armed themselves, and began raiding the Italian countryside. The revolt grew, attracting runaway slaves and some free poor, eventually fielding an army of tens of thousands. For 2 years, Spartacus defeated Roman armies, humiliating the Republic. He wasn't trying to overthrow Rome, just to escape, leading his followers toward the Alps to leave Italy. But politics within the rebel army, and the difficulty of moving such a large group, prevented this. Finally, Marcus Crassus led a massive Roman force that trapped and defeated Spartacus's army. Spartacus died in battle, and 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, a brutal message about the consequences of rebellion. Spartacus became a symbol, showing that even gladiators, the lowest of the low, could threaten Rome if they organized. This was terrifying to the elite, and inspired later revolutionaries who saw Spartacus as a freedom fighter. But at the time, his defeat reinforced the power of the state and the futility of resistance. Female gladiators existed, though rarely. These were called gladiatrices, and they fought each other or sometimes against dwarfs in novelty matches. Evidence comes from a few inscriptions and references in histories. They were considered shocking and titillating, women doing something completely contrary to Roman gender norms. Some sources suggest they fought topless, adding sexual spectacle to violence. Emperor Septimius Severus eventually banned female gladiators in the early 3rd century CE, considering them dishonorable to Roman dignitas. The question of what happened to gladiators' bodies after death is grimmer than you'd think. The dead were dragged from the arena by attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, or Mercury, guide of souls. Bodies were stripped of valuable armor and weapons, then disposed of in mass graves outside the city. Some gladiator cemeteries have been excavated, showing hundreds of bodies buried with minimal ceremony, physical evidence of the carnage. Gladiators' lives between fights were strange, confined to barracks, heavily guarded, but often treated reasonably well. They were valuable property, investments worth protecting. They received medical care, good food, and training. Some had relationships with women, fathered children, and lived semi-normal lives when not fighting, but they had no freedom, could be forced to fight at any time, and faced the constant possibility of death. The psychological toll must have been immense. How do you process killing someone, or nearly being killed, then returning to normal life? How do you cope with watching colleagues die? Some gladiators probably became callous, treating it as a job. Others struggled with what we'd now recognize as PTSD. Ancient sources don't discuss this much. Psychological trauma wasn't a recognized concept, but it surely existed. As Christianity spread, attitudes toward the games shifted slowly. Christian writers condemned them as murder, worship of false gods, and corruption of souls. Church leaders pressured converts not to attend, making attendance a test of faith. But the games were so culturally embedded that even Christian emperors continued them for a while, banning the most extreme elements gradually over decades. The traditional end date for gladiatorial games is 404 CE, when a Christian monk named Telemachus allegedly jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the outraged crowd. Emperor Honorius, supposedly moved by this martyrdom, banned gladiatorial combat. This story is probably legendary. The games did end around this time, mostly because the Western Empire was collapsing and couldn't afford them. Chariot racing continued longer, into the Byzantine period in the East, showing it was more socially acceptable than gladiatorial combat. The Hippodrome in Constantinople featured races until the 12th century CE, over 700 years after Western gladiatorial games ended. Violence against animals and criminals persisted even longer in various forms. What can we learn from Roman games? They show how societies can normalize horrific violence when it serves cultural or political purposes. They demonstrate the power of spectacle in controlling populations, providing distraction and emotional release. They reveal the strange way humans can simultaneously recognize someone's humanity, admiring a gladiator's courage, while treating them as disposable property. They also show human fascination with mortality and danger. We're drawn to watching others face death, possibly as a way to process our own mortality from safe distance. Modern sports, especially combat sports like boxing or MMA, carry echoes of gladiatorial games, controlled violence for entertainment. The line between ancient games and modern entertainment is blurrier than we'd like to admit. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, imagine sitting in the Colosseum on a hot afternoon. The crowd around you cheers and shouts. In the arena below, two gladiators circle each other, weapons ready, each knowing that one might die in the next few minutes. The sun beats down on sand already stained with blood from earlier fights. The smell of sweat, animals, and thousands of humans packed together is overwhelming. And you're part of it, one voice among thousands, watching humanity's capacity for both courage and cruelty on simultaneous display. Were the Romans uniquely cruel, or were they just more honest about impulses all humans share? That's not for me to judge, but understanding their games, what they meant and why they mattered, helps us understand Rome and maybe ourselves, the parts we'd rather not acknowledge, but that exist nonetheless. Rest now, and let the roar of ancient crowds fade into the gentle quiet of night, carrying you toward dreams that are hopefully less violent but no less vivid than the spectacles that entertained millions across an empire that spanned the known world. And more, we've discussed daily life in Rome, and the brutal entertainment that captivated its people. Now let's explore what made Rome into an empire in the first place. Its military. The Roman legions were the most effective fighting force in the ancient world for centuries, conquering everything from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. But this wasn't achieved through technological superiority or sheer numbers. It was discipline, organization, flexibility, and an almost fanatical commitment to victory at any cost. So let's understand how Roman soldiers lived, fought, and built an empire that shaped Western civilization. First, let's establish scope. The Roman Empire at its maximum extent under Trajan in 117 CE controlled about 2.5 million square miles, with a population estimated at 90 million people. This wasn't achieved quickly. Rome started as a small city-state in central Italy, one among many. Through centuries of almost constant warfare, gradually defeated neighbors, allies, and enemies, expanding first throughout Italy, then the Mediterranean, and finally across much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The early Roman army was a citizen militia. Every Roman citizen who met property requirements was obligated to serve when called. This worked when Rome fought seasonal campaigns against nearby cities. But as wars became longer and more distant, the militia system became impractical. Farmers couldn't spend years away from their fields, so in 107 BCE, Gaius Marius reformed the military, creating a professional standing army where soldiers served 25-year careers, received regular pay, and earned land grants upon retirement. This Marian reform transformed Rome militarily and politically. Professional soldiers were more skilled and reliable than temporary militias, but they were also loyal to their generals, who paid them and provided their retirement benefits, more than to the abstract Roman state. This contributed to later civil wars, when generals used armies to pursue political power. But in the short term, it created the legions that conquered the Mediterranean world. A Roman legion was the fundamental military unit, ideally comprising about 5,000 infantry plus support personnel and attached auxiliaries. Legionaries were Roman citizens, volunteers who signed up for 20-25 years of service. Pay was modest but regular, about 225 denarii per year in the early empire, gradually increasing. Deductions for food, equipment, and burial fund reduced this, but it was still more reliable income than many civilians earned. Training was intense and never-ending. New recruits underwent basic training covering marching, weapons drill, formation fighting, and Roman military discipline. Then, throughout their careers, regular training continued. Legionaries marched 20 miles in full gear regularly, both for fitness and to practice rapid deployment. They practiced sword and shield techniques against wooden posts. They dug practice fortifications. The Roman military believed training should be harder than battle, so when actual combat came, soldiers performed almost automatically. Roman equipment was functional and standardized. Every legionary had similar gear, creating uniformity that simplified logistics and training. The primary weapon was the gladius, a short sword about 18-24 inches long, designed for stabbing in close formation. The gladius was devastatingly effective in trained hands, allowing rapid thrusts between shields that could kill or disable opponents while protecting the wielder. The pilum, a heavy javelin, was thrown just before close combat. Its soft iron shank would bend on impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back and weighing down shields it stuck in. 2 pila per soldier meant a volley of javelins hitting enemy formations just before legionaries charged, disrupting enemy ranks and shields. The scutum, the rectangular curved shield, was perhaps the most important piece of equipment. Made of wood covered with leather and edged with metal, it protected from shoulder to knee. Legionaries fought in tight formation, shields overlapping, creating a wall that was extremely difficult to break. Shield discipline. Maintaining formation no matter what was drilled endlessly because breaking formation meant death. Armor evolved over time. In the early empire, lorica segmentata, the famous banded armor of overlapping metal strips, was common and provided excellent protection while allowing flexibility. Earlier and later periods used lorica hamata, chainmail, or lorica squamata, scale armor. Helmets protected the head and usually had cheek guards and neck protection. All this equipment was heavy, 60 pounds total, yet soldiers marched long distances carrying it, plus food, tools, and personal items. Roman military discipline was legendary and brutal. Soldiers lived under strict codes of conduct. Punishment for minor infractions might be extra duties, reduced rations, or beatings. For serious crimes like cowardice, desertion, or mutiny, punishments were severe. Decimation, executing every 10th man in a unit that had failed badly, was rare, but did happen, creating terror and ensuring soldiers feared their own officers as much as the enemy. This harsh discipline created cohesion and reliability. Roman legions could be trusted to follow orders, even in desperate situations, because soldiers knew the consequences of not following orders were worse than anything the enemy could do. This made Roman formations incredibly solid and difficult to break. Legion organization was hierarchical and sophisticated. The basic unit was the contubernium, 8 men who shared a tent and fought together, creating tight bonds. 10 contubernia formed a century of 80 men, led by a centurion, the backbone of the Roman officer corps. Centurions were experienced soldiers promoted from the ranks, hard men who knew their business and commanded absolute respect and fear. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts made a legion. This organization allowed flexibility. A legion could fight as a single mass or break into smaller units for different tasks. Centuries could operate independently if needed, or combine into larger formations. Cohorts could be deployed in waves, the first 3 cohorts engaging while others maneuvered or held reserve. This tactical flexibility gave Roman commanders options other ancient armies lacked. Command structure placed significant authority with centurions, while strategic decisions rested with the legate, the legion commander, usually a senator with political connections, but also military experience. Tribunes, young aristocrats, served as staff officers, learning military leadership. This mixed professional soldiers, the centurions, with politically connected leaders, sometimes causing tension but generally working effectively. Daily life for legionaries was routine and exhausting. Soldiers woke at dawn, performed exercises, then worked on whatever tasks were assigned: training, construction, maintenance, guard duty. Roman camps were semi-permanent fortifications, even temporary camps built during campaigns. Every evening, returning from march, soldiers dug ditches, erected palisades, and created a fortified camp before resting. This constant fortification building trained soldiers in engineering and meant Roman armies always had secure bases. Permanent frontier forts were essentially small cities. They included barracks, headquarters buildings, granaries, workshops, hospitals, baths, and temples. Soldiers lived in these forts for years, forming communities. Many took local wives, unofficial since soldiers couldn't legally marry until Septimius Severus allowed it in 197 CE, and raised families nearby. Upon retirement, many veterans settled near their old forts, creating permanent Roman populations in frontier regions. Food was basic but adequate. The main rations were grain, usually wheat, olive oil, and sour wine, pasca. Soldiers ground grain and baked bread, or made porridge. When possible, they supplemented rations with meat, vegetables, and cheese purchased or foraged. On campaign, logistics of feeding thousands of men were enormous challenges. Roman supply trains and depots were sophisticated systems that usually kept armies fed, though failures could cause disaster. Religion in the military was important. Each legion had standards, including the aquila, eagle, a sacred symbol representing the legion's honor. Losing the eagle was the ultimate disgrace. Legions worshipped their standards, making offerings and swearing oaths by them. Traditional Roman gods were honored, especially Mars, god of war. Soldiers also adopted foreign gods, particularly Mithras, a Persian deity whose cult became extremely popular in the military, offering brotherhood, moral codes, and promises of afterlife salvation. Now let's discuss how Romans actually fought, because their tactics were as important as their equipment. The typical Roman battle formation was 3 lines. The hastati, younger soldiers, formed the first line. The princeps, experienced soldiers in their prime, formed the second. The triarii, veterans, formed the third as a reserve. This changed over time, becoming more flexible, but the principle of multiple lines with reserves remained. Battle began with skirmishers, light troops screening the main formation, harassing the enemy with javelins and slings. As armies closed, legionaries threw their pila, disrupting enemy formations. Then they charged, slamming into enemy lines with shields and stabbing with short swords. The fight became brutal, pushing, stabbing, trying to break enemy cohesion. Roman training and discipline usually gave them advantage in this grinding combat. If the first line wavered, the second line would reinforce or replace them, fresh troops entering battle while tired men withdrew. If the second line struggled, the third line, the veterans, would enter, usually deciding the battle. This rotation of lines kept Romans fresh, while enemies fought with increasingly exhausted troops. It was grinding, methodical warfare, not heroic, but devastatingly effective. Roman generals understood combined arms warfare. Legionaries were heavy infantry, the core, but they were supported by auxiliaries, non-citizen troops recruited from conquered peoples. Auxiliaries provided cavalry, light infantry, archers, slingers, and specialized troops. A Syrian archer, a Germanic cavalryman, a Balearic slinger, all might fight for Rome, bringing skills legionaries lacked. Auxiliaries served 25 years and received Roman citizenship upon discharge, integrating conquered peoples into the empire. This was brilliant policy, turning potential enemies into loyal soldiers and eventually Romans. Their sons could join the legions as citizens. Over generations, conquered peoples became Romans through military service. Sieges were another Roman specialty. Besieging fortified cities required engineering, patience, and ruthlessness. Romans built siege works, massive earthen ramps, allowing assault on walls, siege towers pushed against fortifications, battering rams to breach gates. The siege of Masada in 73-74 CE shows this. Romans built a massive ramp up a mountain to reach a fortress, taking months but eventually succeeding through sheer determination and engineering skill. Starvation was a common siege tactic. Surround the city, cut off supplies, wait. Defending populations faced grim choices: surrender, attempt breakout, or starve. Romans were usually patient, knowing time worked in their favor. When cities finally surrendered or were taken, treatment varied. Surrender early meant leniency. Resist and force Rome to suffer casualties meant harsh punishment. The city might be sacked, population enslaved, buildings destroyed as an example to others. The most famous example of Roman ruthlessness is Carthage. After 3 Punic Wars spanning over a century, Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE. The city was burned, the population killed or enslaved, and supposedly salt was plowed into the earth so nothing would grow. Though this last detail is probably mythical, but the point was made: resist Rome to the end, and you'll be obliterated. Engineering was a Roman military strength. Roads connected the empire, originally built for military movement, but benefiting commerce and communication. These weren't dirt tracks, but paved, cambered roads with drainage, some of which still exist 2,000 years later. Legions built these roads, along with bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications, making soldiers into construction workers between campaigns. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, stretching 73 miles across the island, was built by legionaries. It wasn't just a wall, but a complex system of forts, mile castles, turrets, and ditches, marking the empire's northern boundary and controlling movement. This massive project took years and thousands of workers, demonstrating Roman engineering capacity and commitment to frontier control. The frontiers, or limes, evolved from temporary campaign boundaries into permanent fortified borders. In Germany, a continuous palisade and ditch system marked the edge of Roman control. In North Africa, forts monitored desert routes. Along the Danube and Rhine rivers, legions garrisoned forts, watching for barbarian movements. These frontiers weren't impermeable, but they channeled movement, allowed monitoring, and provided bases for punitive expeditions when needed. Frontier life was strange, neither fully at war nor at peace. Soldiers spent years watching barbarians across rivers or walls, occasionally skirmishing, sometimes trading, developing complex relationships. Some barbarians became federates, allied tribes paid to defend Roman borders against other barbarians, a policy that worked for centuries but eventually became problematic when federates became stronger and Rome weaker. Naval power was equally important, though less celebrated. Rome wasn't naturally a naval power, but necessity drove development of powerful fleets. The war with Carthage, the supreme naval power of the Western Mediterranean, forced Romans to build warships. They supposedly copied Carthaginian designs from a captured ship, mass-producing galleys with crews trained on land before taking to sea. Roman warships used corvus, a boarding ramp that locked onto enemy ships, turning naval combat into infantry combat. where Roman soldiers excelled. This innovation helped defeat Carthaginian naval superiority. Later, Roman fleets controlled the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, RC, suppressing piracy and enabling trade and troop movements. The Roman military wasn't just for conquest, but for maintaining order. Legions suppressed rebellions, policed frontiers, and provided muscle for imperial administration. They were simultaneously army, police force, border patrol, and construction corps. This multifunctional role made them expensive, but invaluable. Costs were enormous. At the empire's height, perhaps 300,000 legionaries and 300,000 auxiliaries served, 600,000 professional soldiers requiring pay, equipment, food, and retirement benefits. This consumed perhaps half the imperial budget. Taxation funded the military, and military needs drove taxation, creating cycles where conquest paid for more conquest through plunder and tribute from new provinces. But eventually expansion stopped. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was no longer expanding significantly. The practical limits had been reached. Deserts, oceans, and regions where conquest costs exceeded benefits. The military shifted from aggressive expansion to defensive consolidation, a fundamental change with long-term consequences. Defensive posture was harder psychologically. Roman culture glorified conquest and military achievement. Emperors gained legitimacy partly through military success. When expansion stopped, emperors still needed victories, so they fought defensive wars, barbarian raids, and sometimes pointless campaigns to maintain martial credibility. Internal use of military force became more common. Civil wars, where Roman legions fought each other, were devastating. The year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE saw multiple claimants using legions to fight for power, ravaging Italy and provinces. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 night of 284 CE, featured nearly 50 years of constant civil war, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. The military became both Rome's protector and its greatest internal threat. Soldiers' loyalties shifted increasingly to generals rather than to Rome abstractly. Soldiers followed commanders who paid well, won victories providing loot, and promised land and benefits. This made generals powerful, but destabilized the state. Eventually, the military essentially chose emperors, killing those they disliked and elevating favorites. The Praetorian Guard in Rome became kingmakers, auctioning the emperorship to the highest bidder on at least one occasion. Barbarian recruitment increased as Roman population declined and military needs grew. Germans, Goths, Sarmatians, even Persians sometimes served in Roman armies. Initially auxiliaries, increasingly they joined legions. Some units were entirely barbarian, commanded by Roman officers, but maintaining tribal identities. This worked while Rome was strong and could pay and control them. But when the empire weakened economically in the 4th and 5th centuries, paying barbarian soldiers became difficult. Some were settled on land, becoming farmer soldiers defending the frontiers. But this created barbarian communities inside the empire with military capacity and group identity separate from Rome. When central authority collapsed in the West, these groups acted independently, carving out kingdoms from Roman territory. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE was less a sudden collapse than a gradual transformation. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odo Acer, a Germanic military leader who declared himself king of Italy, but notionally ruled as an agent of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. The reality was that the Western Empire had fragmented into barbarian kingdoms, where Germanic kings ruled Roman populations using Roman administrative systems. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, survived another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. It maintained Roman law, administration, and military traditions in modified forms. Byzantine armies were different from classical Roman legions, more heavily reliant on cavalry, professional heavy infantry called cataphracts, and sophisticated fortifications. But they considered themselves Romans, Romeo, and preserved Roman identity until Constantinople's fall to the Ottomans in 1453 CE. What made Roman military success possible? Several factors, discipline and training, created reliable soldiers who followed orders and maintained formation under stress. Organization allowed tactical flexibility and efficient logistics. Engineering enabled infrastructure supporting military operations. willingness to adapt and learn from enemies meant Romans incorporated better tactics, weapons, and ideas whenever encountered. Political stability, at least in the earlier periods, provided consistent support and resources for military operations. But perhaps most importantly, Roman military success came from persistence and ruthlessness. Rome lost battles, sometimes spectacularly. Cannae in 216 BCE saw Hannibal destroy an entire Roman army, killing perhaps 50,000 men to 70,000 Romans in a single day. The Teutoburg forest disaster in 9 CE saw 3 entire legions, about 20,000 men, annihilated by Germanic tribes. These were catastrophic defeats that would have destroyed other states. But Rome didn't surrender. After Cannae, Rome recruited new armies and kept fighting, eventually defeating Carthage through attrition and refusal to quit. After Teutoburg, Rome abandoned Germania Magna but reinforced the Rhine frontier and ensured the loss was avenged. Roman persistence, continuing despite losses that would break other nations, eventually overwhelmed enemies who couldn't sustain long-term warfare against such a relentless opponent. This persistence had a dark side: total war. Rome would devastate enemy territories, enslave populations, and create deserts, and call it peace, in Tacitus's bitter phrase. The Jewish revolt of 66 3 CE saw Rome destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple, kill hundreds of thousands, and enslave tens of thousands more. It was brutal overkill, meant to ensure no future revolts. It worked, at least until the Bar Kokhba revolt, 60 years later, which Rome suppressed even more brutally, essentially depopulating Judea and scattering the Jewish population across the empire and beyond. Roman military culture celebrated virtus, manly courage, gloria, glory through achievement, and fides, loyalty to comrades and commanders. These values created cohesive, motivated units, willing to suffer enormous casualties for victory, but they also created a glorification of violence and conquest that contributed to constant warfare, internal and external, that eventually exhausted the empire. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine a Roman legionary on night watch at a frontier fort. It's cold, you're far from home, and you won't see Rome again for years. Maybe never if you die here. Behind you, comrades sleep in barracks, fellow soldiers you trust with your life. Ahead, darkness hides potential enemies, barbarians who might raid tonight or wait weeks, probing for weakness. You're part of the greatest military machine the ancient world ever produced, but you're also just a man, tired, cold, worried about family back home, hoping to survive your 25 years and retire to a small farm somewhere warm. The empire you serve is vast, powerful, and seems eternal. But already cracks are showing. The frontiers are harder to hold, barbarians are stronger and bolder, money is scarce, and pay is irregular. The empire that conquered the world is learning that holding it is even harder than winning it was. And you, standing watch on a cold night at the edge of the world, are all that stands between civilization and chaos, at least in this small corner of an empire too vast for anyone to truly comprehend. The legions held the empire together for centuries, but nothing lasts forever. Rome fell, not in a day but over decades and centuries, worn down by the very forces it had unleashed: constant warfare, economic strain, internal division, and the impossibility of maintaining permanent hegemony over such vast territories. But the legacy survived. Roman military organization influenced every Western military since. Roman engineering, roads and walls, and aqueducts, some still functioning after 2 millennia. Roman law, the foundation of legal systems across Europe and beyond. Roman language, Latin, evolving into French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and influencing English profoundly. The empire fell, but in a very real sense, we still live in Rome's shadow. Rest now, and let the measured tread of legionaries marching, the construction of eternal roads, and the raising of improbable fortifications in impossible places carry you gently into dreams. The soldiers are gone, their names forgotten, but their roads still lead somewhere. Their walls still stand guard over empty frontiers, and their legacy remains, waiting patiently in the foundations of our civilization for anyone willing to look and remember. Sleep well, knowing that human achievement, even built on war and conquest, can transcend its origins and create lasting value that outlives those who built it. The Roman military conquered the world, but in the end, It was Roman ideas, organization, and culture that truly proved immortal. And that's not a bad legacy for soldiers who thought they were just following orders and trying to survive their next campaign.